Ladies and gentlemen, Jean Swanson.
So hi everybody, thanks so much for coming out. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we're on the stolen territory of the Squamish people, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, and thank them so much for allowing us to be here. I watched No Fixed Address on Knowledge Network, and at the end of the movie, an Indigenous woman talks about how Vancouver is basically on stolen Indigenous land. And I think this is maybe the most important part of the film. When settlers think about housing, we also have to be thinking about how we can either give back the land that we're on or compensate the people it was stolen from. And if you steal a car and get caught, you have to give it back. And so I think that's a really important point at the end of the movie. The movie is about the housing situation in Vancouver. It deals mostly with housing for working and racialized people. It touches on homelessness, and it doesn't really come to a conclusion about the solutions. So I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about solutions to the housing crisis. These are the solutions that I proposed when I ran for council last October. So just to start off with what the movie is about and what most of you know, but just to restate it, what is the housing situation? It's 2,138 counted homeless people who have half the life expectancy as other people last year. The highest homeless count ever. It's average rents for people looking for apartments are over $2,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. To buy a condo, you now need $500,000. To buy a house, you need over $1 million. It's way worse if you're a renter and a person of color or Indigenous trying to find a place to live on, because with a really low vacancy rate, it's so easy for landlords to discriminate against people for whatever reason. And now we do have a really low vacancy rate. So the main reason housing is so expensive is because its value is going up so fast in the housing market. And because in the market system, housing is a commodity, it's not a place to live. So one way to try and tackle this is by getting more and more housing out of the market, or for renters, providing strong regulations of the market. Did any of you guys see the exhibit at the planetarium about social housing in Vienna? It was quite an exhibit. They have amazing social housing in Vienna. 60% of people live in social housing, and it's beautiful. They have swimming pools and daycares and community centers all integrated with the social housing. And other places like Singapore and Hong Kong also have huge proportions of their housing as social housing, and it's nice housing and it's not stigmatizing. I was recently asked to be on a panel to talk about, quote, what does a just housing market look like? So when you're talking about the market, you're not talking about justice. You're talking about the people who own the most already, reaping the most in the future. And that's unjust, and that's what we have to tackle. So let's start with the people who are dying because of the housing situation. That would be people who are homeless. It takes about $200,000 and 3 to 7 years to build a social housing unit on city-owned land in Vancouver. But it only takes about $75,000 and 6 months to put a modular housing unit up in Vancouver. So we need to get people off the street fast so they aren't dying, put them in modular housing, and build nice social housing they can move to when the modular housing is over, because it's only temporary. So building a modular housing unit for every homeless person in Vancouver would cost about $160 million. But because everyone knows it's cheaper to keep homeless people in housing than it is to keep them on the street, it would pay for itself in 4 years. So for me, this first number one solution is find the money by hook or crook to get homeless people off the street and into modular housing, and do it fast. So the next worst off are renters who are paying outrageous rents. The biggest culprit here is the fact that our alleged rent control doesn't apply to when a tenant moves. So only if the tenant stays. If the tenant stays, then rent can only go up by, this year it's 4%. But I think that's too high. But being able to raise rents between tenancies gives landlords who want to make more money the incentive to get rid of their tenants, especially if they're paying relatively low rents. So that's why we have all these rent evictions happening. I've personally tried to help people who have been rent evicted. The landlord tries to get rid of them for any reason, saying they have too much stuff, saying they want to renovate. Sometimes they even just buy them out or want to buy them out, offer the people thousands of dollars to move so that they can re-rent the unit at a much higher rent. And so this is happening in the downtown Eastside, it's happening in the West End, it's happening in Grandview, it's happening all over the city. And the solution to the problem is virtually free for taxpayers. We need a rent freeze, but this is currently a provincial responsibility, and the province needs to be pushed to implement it, or at the very least to give the city the power to implement it. At the very, very, very least, the province needs to amend the Residential Tenancy Act to make rent control apply to the unit, not the tenant. So landlords can't raise rents between tenancies. That wouldn't cost taxpayers. It would cost virtually nothing to taxpayers, and it would give renters a lot more security. So but then there is the question of how do we get housing out of the market? So we have a situation in Vancouver where people who own homes are making more money by property appreciation than by working. So there was one researcher who said that in Vancouver, single-family homeowners collectively earned about $25 billion in 2016, just by, he said, twiddling their thumbs. So that's 7 million more than the people in Vancouver earned by working. So in my campaign, we proposed a mansion tax. This is also provincial, unless we convince the province to give the city the power to have progressive property taxes, just like the province and the feds have progressive income taxes. And the city, since the campaign, has actually put this idea into its social housing housing strategy, the idea of having a progressive property tax. So that's a good step forward. And it's totally possible that the city could that the province could give the city this power. Just this year, the province gave the city, the Liberal government actually, gave the city the power to tax vacant homes. So sometimes when the city asks the province for a new power, they actually give it to them. And if the province could give the city the power to tax property progressively, that would be great. You could calculate a progressive property tax in a whole bunch of ways. And with different amounts of revenue and different people affected. But in my campaign, we just proposed, for example, you could, if you left houses worth $5 million alone and didn't make any change to them, and just taxed houses worth between 5 and 10 million if you added an extra 1% of their property value onto their taxes. And if the house was worth over 10 million, add an extra 2%. I got to get clear here. 1% between 5 and 10 million and 2% over 10 million. We calculated that would mean that the guy that owns the most expensive house in Vancouver, which is Chip Wilson, who's a billionaire, he'd have to pay about $1.5 million a year in property tax. So you could calculate it a lot of ways, but the way we calculated it, you could get 174 million by doing that. A year, 174 million a year in extra revenue, and if we're all dedicated to housing, it would be enough to end homelessness in 1 year. Pretty good, eh? Then we could do two things. We could start building social housing that would be outside the market and start giving land back to Indigenous people to put some real teeth into reconciliation. For 174 million, we could build 870 housing units a year that would be out of the market and available to people in the lower half of the income spectrum. Of course, federal and provincial governments need to be contributing more, and we need to push them to do this like they used to. And they used to fund it in the old days by increasing taxes, a lot of it on the wealthy. So you guys, I'm incredibly low tech. And I brought 10 copies of a graph here. So you can pass it around and take a look at it. But it's this incredible graph I got from an academic study in 2015. And it basically starts in 1972 with the amount of social housing that the federal that used to be built in Canada. So it goes like this: 30,000 units in 1972, and it goes, and it flatlines after about 2000 with one little hiccup in 2006, a hiccup up to about 3,000. So it goes from about 30,000 in 1972. This is the number of social housing units built in Canada. 30,000 in 1972, kind of like this. And then by 2000, flat lines. Tiny burp in 2006, more flat line. About 1,500 units a year in those years after 2000. So it shows that it is possible to build lots of social housing, and that it has been done here, and that it's not a communist plot. So there's other ways we could get lots of money for social housing and give land back to its owners. The homeowners grant costs BC taxpayers about $800 million a year. It goes to people who already own homes. Renters don't get anything. If that $800 million a year were converted to social housing fund, it could build 4,000 units a year of social housing on city-owned land. Or take the $25 billion that homeowners' property appreciated just in Vancouver just in 2016. What if people who sold their homes had to pay some tax on the amount that it appreciated? If we only took $2 billion of the $25 billion through a capital gains tax, that would be enough to build 10,000 units of social housing. You guys, it wouldn't take a lot. Or to give back quite a bit of land to the original owners. So I'm thinking we need to start getting out there with the message that there are ways we could fund social housing, and we need the social housing we need, and hopefully people will catch on, and we can get a lot of housing out of the market. And so housing really is a human right and not a commodity, and so we can really give at least some of the land back to its original caretakers. So those are some of the measures that would help deal with the housing crisis that the film is talking about. They are doable, they would work, and all we need is a political will to implement them. Thanks, guys.